I don't think most people actually realize how early it starts. You don't really wake up one day and decide that other people's opinions are going to shape how you live your life. It kinda just happens slowly, over time, without you noticing. At first, it's small things, like thinking before you speak, replaying what you said after you've already said it, wondering if something came out wrong, or if someone interpreted it differently than you meant. And it feels normal, because everyone does it to some extent, so you don't question it. But over time, it starts spreading into more areas of your life. It's not just what you say anymore, it's how you act, it's how you sit, it's how you walk into a room, it's how you react to things. Even how you exist around other people starts to feel slightly adjusted. Like there's a version of you that naturally shows up, and then there's a second version that filters everything before it comes out. And most people don't even notice the switch happening. It just becomes their default. And I used to think I was just being aware, like socially intelligent, or careful, or just understanding how people work. But there's a difference between being aware of how you come across and constantly monitoring how you come across. Because awareness is natural, it flows, but monitoring yourself is different. It's heavy. It makes everything feel slightly less natural than it should be. And I think part of the reason it builds so quietly is because it actually starts off useful. Caring what people think helps you avoid embarrassment. It helps you fit in. It helps you learn social boundaries. It helps you not say things that might be taken the wrong way. So your brain learns early on that this is important. But the problem is it doesn't stop at this useful stage. It keeps applying that logic to everything. Even situations where nobody is really judging you. Even moments where it doesn't actually matter. And that's where things start to shift without you realizing it. Because now you're not just living your life, you're also imagining how your life looks from the outside. Like there's always a second perspective running around in your head. Watching, evaluating, reacting, even when nothing is actually happening. And the strange part is, most of the time, people are not thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are. Everyone is mostly focused on themselves, their own thoughts, their own insecurities, their own moments they're overthinking. But your brain doesn't naturally assume that. It assumes you're being noticed more than you actually are. So you end up living under pressure that doesn't fully exist in reality. And I think that creates a kind of quiet tension in everyday life. Because you're not just doing things anymore. You're doing things while thinking how they look. And that second layer changes everything. It makes simple things feel slightly heavier, less natural, more calculated, even when nothing is actually wrong. I think one of the weirdest parts of all this is that it doesn't actually feel like a problem while it's happening. It just feels like normal thinking, like you're just being careful, or aware, or socially switched on. But underneath that, there's this constant background process running where you might check how everything might be perceived. Not just big things, but small things too. The way you phrase something, the way you respond to a message, the way you act in a group, even the timing of when you say something. And you don't even realize how often you're doing it, because it comes automatic. And I think social media has made this more intense without people really noticing. Because now there's always a feeling that something could be seen, even if it never is. You post something and immediately think there's instinct to check it. Not just likes and comments, but for meaning. Did that look okay? Did that come off weird? Did I try too hard? Did I not try enough? And even if nobody says anything negative, your brain fills in the gaps anyways. Because silence doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels like interpretation. And I think that's where people start to lose the difference between reality and imagined reaction. Because in reality, most things you do are not being analysed by other people the way you think they are. But in your head, it feels like they are. So you end up reacting to that imagined version instead of what's actually happening. And over time, that starts shaping how you behave in real situations, without you even realising it. There's also this thing that happens where you start remembering embarrassment way more than others do. Like you'll think about something you said or did days ago, maybe even weeks, and it still feels present, still feels slightly uncomfortable. But other people involved probably forgot about it completely, And that mismatch is what creates a lot of unnecessary pressure, because your brain treats it like it's still active, even when it's already gone for everyone else. And because of that, you start trying to avoid these moments happening again, even small ones, even harmless ones. You become a bit more cautious, a bit more filtered, a bit more controlled in how you show up. And at first, it doesn't really feel like it's changing anything major, but slowly, it does. You stop speaking as freely, you stop reacting as naturally, you stop saying the first thing that comes to your mind, and you start saying the version of it that feels safest, the version that's least likely to be misunderstood. And the more you do that, the more it becomes your default way of operating. But the issue is, that version of you isn't fully you. It's a version that's being edited in real time. A version designed to avoid judgment rather than express yourself. And the more you rely on it, the harder it becomes to just act naturally without thinking. Because now there's always that pause, that filter, that check in your head before you do anything. And I think the deeper things understand all of this is that most people don't actually want to be judged less as much as they want to feel safe around being themselves. But those two get mixed together. So you start thinking safety comes from approval. And approval comes from something you chase without even realizing it. Not because you want attention, but because you want to feel okay existing as yourself in front of other people. I think at a certain point, it stops being about other people. It just starts becoming about you. About how you see yourself when you think other people are looking at you. And that's where things get a bit more subtle, because you don't really notice the shift happening. It's not like a clear moment where you decide to change who you are. It's more like small adjustments over time. Little edits to how you act, how you speak, how you present yourself. Until one day you realize you're not really sure where the real you ends at the filtered you begins. And I don't think most people ever consciously choose that. I think it happens through reputation, through experience, through trying to avoid discomfort. You start to notice that certain versions of yourself get better reactions than others. Maybe you say something funny and people respond well, so you lean into that version of yourself a bit more. Or you act more confident in the situation and it goes fine, so you try to repeat it. And slowly, without even meaning to, you start building a version of yourself that is shaped by what gets approval, by what gets accepted, by what feels safe socially. And that version starts becoming the default. But the problem is, that version isn't always fully aligned with how you actually feel inside. So there's this small gap that starts forming, because how you are naturally, and how you present yourself, and at first it's small enough that you don't even notice it. But over time, that gap can start to feel a bit heavier, because you're constantly aware of it in the background, even if you fully can't explain it. And I think that's where a lot of overthinking starts to become deeper than just overthinking. It's not just, did I say the wrong thing? It becomes, was that actually me or the version of me that I thought people would like more? And that second question is the one that sticks a bit more. Because now it's not just about how you're perceived, it's about wherever you're showing is even authentic anymore. And when that starts happening, you begin to rely more on external feedback than internal certainty. So instead of just knowing how you feel about someone, you start waiting for reactions. Did they laugh? Did they respond well? Did that land right? Did that feel normal to them? And if the reaction is positive, you'll feel okay. But if there's uncertainty or silence, you'll start questioning yourself more. Not just the situation, but you. And I think that's one of the most draining parts of it, because your confidence stops becoming something internal. It becomes something you're constantly checking externally. Like you're trying to measure yourself through other people's responses in real time. And that's never stable, because people aren't consistent. Their mood changes, their attention changes, their reactions change. So if you rely on it, then you're always going to feel slightly off balance. And I think the deeper issue is that you start forgetting what's actually you without thinking on the outside input. You start to second guessing your own instincts. You pause before you express opinions. You soften your reactions. You hold back parts of yourself just in case they're not received well. And slowly, you become more shaped by avoidance than expression. Not because you wanted to hide yourself, but because you're trying to not be judged for showing it. I think this is where it starts affecting relationships and connection in a way people don't really expect. Because on the surface, it looks like you're just trying to be a good version of yourself around other people. You're being aware, you're being polite, you're trying not to say the wrong thing, you're trying to make a good impression. But underneath that, there's a kind of tension that starts to build without you noticing. Because you're not just interacting anymore, you're managing how you be perceived while interacting. And that changes everything. It makes conversations less natural, because you're not fully in them. Part of your attention is always slightly outside the moment, checking, analyzing, adjusting, thinking ahead, wondering how what you said would land instead of just being in what you're saying. And even if the other person doesn't notice anything, you feel it internally. The slight delay, the slight hesitation, that feeling of not being fully relaxed. And I think the strange thing is, people often think they're doing this to make connections better. Like, if they just act right or say the right things or avoid awkward moments, then people will like them more. But actually what happens is, the more you filter yourself, the less real the conversation feels. Because connection doesn't really form through the perfect behavior. It forms through honesty, through natural reactions, through moments that aren't planned or calculated. And when you start removing those natural parts of yourself, even slightly, people can still sense it. Not always consciously, but in a subtle way. Like the interaction feels a bit smoother, but also a bit less real, a bit more controlled, a bit less human. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused, because they think the goal is to be liked by everyone. But being liked isn't the same as being understood. And it's not the same as being connected to someone. You can be liked for a version of yourself that isn't fully you, but that doesn't always lead to something meaningful. It just leads to something safe. And safety isn't always the same as closeness. Sometimes the safer you try to be socially, the more distance you actually create. Because people connect to what feels real, not what feels perfectly adjusted. And when you're constantly adjusting yourself, even slightly, you start becoming harder to fully connect with. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're not fully present as yourself. And I think this is where some people start to feel a bit disconnected in their own relationships or friendships, even if everything looks fine from the outside. You can be talking to people, laughing, hanging out, being social, but still feel slightly separate from it all internally. Like you're there, but not fully there. Like you're participating, but also observing at the same time. And over time, that becomes normal, so you don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You just assume that's how social interactions feel. A bit of thinking, a bit of monitoring, a bit of holding yourself back. But it doesn't have to feel like that. It only starts feeling like that when you begin prioritizing perception over presence. I think a lot of people assume that the goal is to stop caring what anyone thinks at all. Like that's what confidence is supposed to be. Just not caring. Being completely unaffected. But I don't think that's realistic. And I don't think that's even healthy. Because at some level, we're always going to care what people think. We're social, it's built into us. The issue isn't caring, it's how much control it has over you. Because there's a difference between being aware of how you come across and being controlled by how you come across. One thing is just understanding social reality, and the other is constantly changing yourself to avoid judgment. And that's where people get stuck. They think confidence means shutting everything off. But real confidence is more than still caring, but not letting it decide everything for you. And I think that's the turning point for a lot of people when they start noticing how exhausting it actually is to constantly think about perception. Not just mentally, but emotionally. Because it takes energy to filter yourself all the time. It takes energy to overcome simple interactions. It takes energy to constantly check how you might be perceived. And at some point, you start realizing the effort isn't actually improving your life. It's just making you more tired. And the funny thing is, most of the things you're worried about don't even last as long in other people's minds. People forget conversations. They forget small awkward moments. They move on faster than your brain does. But if your mind keeps replaying things like they're still active, as if they matter, even when nobody else is thinking about them anymore, and I think that's where you start to realize something really important. There's a lot of pressure you feel socially isn't coming from reality. It's coming from memory, from anticipation, from imagination, from trying to control outcomes that are already gone. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You don't suddenly stop caring, but you start questioning whether the thing you're worried about is actually happening, or if something you're actually projecting. And that small gap between those two things is where a lot of freedom starts. Because when you stop assuming every interaction is being judged heavily, you start relaxing a bit more. You start speaking a bit more. You start reacting without editing yourself as much. And when you start noticing that nothing really falls apart when you do that, in fact, things often feel better, more real, more connected. And I think that's where people don't really expect that. That letting go of overthinking doesn't make you less socially aware. It actually makes you more present. And presence is what people actually respond to. Not perfection, not calculated behavior, just you being in the moment without constantly stepping outside of it in your head. And maybe that's the real balance. Not trying to stop caring what people think completely, but learning to stop letting decide who you are in the moment. Because the more you do that, the more you realize you don't actually need to perform life to be accepted in it. You just need to be in it. I think after a while, you start noticing something a bit strange. Even when nothing is actually happening, your mind still feels busy. Like there's always a background thought running in the back of your head about how you're coming across, or about how someone might think, or whether you said something in the right way. And it almost becomes normal. Like silence in your mind doesn't actually really feel like silence anymore. It feels like something is missing. And I think that's where you realize it's not even about specific situations anymore. It becomes a habit of thinking, a default setting. So even when you're alone, even when there's nobody to judge you, you still kind of imagine it. You still rehearse things, you still question things, you still evaluate yourself from an outside perspective. And that's the part that's hard to notice, because there's no obvious trigger. It just runs in the background all the time. And the more it runs, the more normal it feels. So you don't really see it as anxiety or overthinking anymore. You just see it as how you think. But it's not actually how you naturally think. It's something you've built over time from experience, memory, embarrassment, comparison, and reputation. And once something becomes your default, it stops feeling like a choice. And I think that's why it's so hard for people to explain this feeling. Because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. You're functioning, you're talking to people, you're living your life. But internally, there's always this extra layer running on top of everything. A layer of self-awareness that doesn't really turn off. And sometimes you only notice it in contrast. Like maybe you're in a moment where you forget about it completely. Maybe you're with someone you're comfortable around, and you're doing something you actually enjoy. And for a short time, you're not thinking about how you're perceiving it all. You're just there, fully in it. And afterwards, you realize how different that felt. How much lighter it was, how much more natural everything was. And that contrast is important, because it shows you that the heavy feeling isn't always the real you. It's just a version of you that's constantly monitoring, constantly adjusting, constantly aware. And that version isn't wrong, it just gets overused. It starts running when it doesn't need to. And I think another part of this is how people start linking their worth to reactions without even realizing it. If something you say gets a good response, you'll feel a bit better about yourself. If it doesn't, you start questioning it. Not just the thing you said, but you. And slowly, your brain starts using other people's reactions as a kind of measurement system for your own value. Even though those reactions are inconsistent, temporary, and often not even that meaningful in the long term. And the issue with that is it makes your self-sense unstable. Because now it depends on situations you can't control. People's moods, their attention, their interpretation of things. And that means your confidence also becomes unstable. It goes up and down based on external signals instead of internal certainty. And I think that's where things start to feel mentally tiring, because you're always waiting for feedback in some form, even in small ways, even when nothing is actually being judged. You're still kind of checking, still kind of measuring, still kind of evaluating yourself through imaginary perspectives. I think when people start to step out of this mindset, it doesn't feel like a big change at first either. There's no moment where everyone suddenly clicks and you're suddenly completely free from caring what anyone thinks. It's way more subtle than that. It's just small moments where you notice you didn't overthink something as much as you normally would. Or you said something without fully rehearsing it in your head first. Or you just acted a bit more natural without immediately analysing how it came across afterwards. And those moments feel slightly unfamiliar at first, like you're not used to them anymore. But over time, you start realising something important. Most of the things you were worried about never actually happened in the way you imagined. The embarrassment wasn't as intense as your mind made it feel. The judgment wasn't as consistent as you thought it was. It wasn't as constant as you thought it was either. The reactions weren't as critical or as focused on you as you assumed. And the gap between expectation and reality slowly starts to change how you think. Because when you spend a lot of time caring about what people think, your brain builds this exaggerated version of social pressure. It makes it feel like every interaction carries weight, like every sentence matters more than it actually does, like every mistake is more visible than it really is. But when you start stepping back, you begin to see that most of this pressure was internal, not external. It's your interpretation of situations, not the situations themselves. And I think that's where things start to shift mentally, because you stop treating every moment like it defines you. You stop assuming people are analysing you as much as you think they're analysing themselves. And you start realising that most people are actually just focused on their own experience. Not yours, not in detail, not in the way you imagined. And it takes a bit of pressure off everything. Not all at once, but gradually. Because you start giving yourself permission to exist without constantly correcting yourself. You speak a bit more freely. You act a bit more naturally. You stop editing every small thing in your head before it comes out, and you realize that nothing really falls apart when you do that. In fact, a lot of the time, things feel better. Conversations feel smoother, interactions feel more real. And I think another important shift is when you start separating your actions from identity a bit more. So instead of thinking, I said something awkward, so I am awkward, you start thinking, I said something awkward in that moment. Just that. Nothing more attached to it. No bigger meaning, no deeper conclusion about who you are as a person. And that separation is huge, because most of the pressure comes from turning small moments into statements about yourself. And when you stop doing that as much, you start becoming more resilient socially without even trying. Not because you stop caring completely, but because you stop overlinking everything to your worth. You start allowing things to just be moments instead of evaluations. What the hell? Evaluations. Sorry, I can't speak. And that changes how you experience everything. I think if you zoom out far enough, it stops being just about confidence or social skills or overthinking. It becomes a bit more human than that. Because at the core of it, most people don't actually want to be judged less. They want to feel okay being themselves while being perceived. And those two are very different things. Because you can remove judgment from other people completely and still not feel comfortable. If you still judge yourself first. If you still assume you're not enough. If you still believe there's a better version of you that needs to show up for people to accept you. They're even in a room full of supportive people, you will still feel that pressure. Not from them, from you. And I think that's the part that most people eventually realize at some point. That the voice in their head is louder than any actual comment you've received. It's more consistent, more critical, more present in every situation. And over time, you start reacting to that voice like it's truth. even though it's just pattern you built over time from past experiences, embarrassment, comparison, and memory. And the reason it sticks so much is because your brain is trying to protect you. It's trying to prevent rejection before it happens. It's trying to help you avoid embarrassment before it shows up. It's trying to keep you socially safe. But in doing that, it ends up making you less free, because you're always adjusting yourself for a problem that might not even exist in the moment. And I think that's where the real shift happens. Not when you stop caring about what people think, but when you stop believing every thought you have about how people see you. Because most of those thoughts aren't observatories, they're predictions. And predictions aren't always reality. And when you start noticing that, you start loosening your grip a bit. You stop treating every interaction like a test. You stop treating every reaction like a verdict on who you are. And you start giving yourself permission to just exist in moments without constantly evaluating them, even if it feels a bit unfamiliar at first. And slowly, you realize something pretty important, because people connect more with presence than perfection, with honesty more than control, with real reactions more than carefully constructed ones. And you don't get that by trying to be harder to be liked. You get that from being in the moment enough to stop editing yourself out of it. And maybe that's the real point of all this. Not becoming someone who doesn't care at all, but becoming someone who doesn't disappear behind their own thoughts when trying to be seen. Because the more you stay present in your own life, the less power imaginary stuff and judgment has over you.